We can also sit. I guess that means we're good to go. All right. Well, let's go through the posture a bit, right? So, in terms of the lower body, you're both sitting cross-legged, right? So, you want to have a sense of having your weight be not exactly evenly distributed, but at least kind of firmly distributed between whatever portions of each leg are making contact with the mat, and also your sit bones sitting on the cushion, right? That, generally speaking, obviously there's more weight on your sit bones, but you want to have a sense of having a solid, platform. And I mean, probably the solidest lower body posture is full lotus, largely because there's even down pressure on both knees in full lotus. But you don't have to do that. It's just worth noting that that's why it's good, right? It's because you've got this really it naturally promotes a kind of left-right balance, and maybe a forward and back balance as well. But the other and in the and in Dogen, the founder of Japanese Soto Zen, in his instructions for Zazen, he he specifies one of two postures: full lotus and half lotus, which is fine, but probably even back in the 13th century, not everybody could do either full lotus or half lotus, right? So the if you know if those are comfortable for you, that's great. If not, then just focus on having, if you're sitting in a cross-legged posture, just focus on having it sort of balanced as much as possible, balanced down pressure on your legs, and a kind of even distribution of weight between your sit bones and your knees. Or so, people also sometimes sit in this sort of crisscross applesauce position. That's also okay too. And sometimes it's hard for people to get their knees down, but depending on what your legs are resting on, when I sit like this, the weight of my legs is on my feet. So just try and get a sense of that being balanced, right? And then up above that, once you've got this sort of solid platform, it should feel really, really kind of solid and firm, right? It makes sense to think about well, for one thing, the tilt in your pelvis. If you tilt your pelvis all the way forward, you get this sort of pinchy feeling in your lower back. If you tilt your pelvis all the way back, you start to feel, first of all, this sort of slight discomfort in your lower back again, but also a lot of stretch and pull along your quads and up into your lower stomach muscles there, right? So you want to find the balance point where you're their muscles in your lower back and in your abdomen in the front can feel pretty relaxed and unstressed, right? And on top of that, it makes sense. The way I imagine this always is, imagine that there's a pillar planted in my hara, right? Which is to say, this place kind of right in the middle of your body, a couple inches below your navel, that's fundamentally the bottom end of your breathing apparatus, right? I try to imagine there's a pillar there and it's holding up my sternum, basically. And what that does, and first of all, it stretches out your sort of belly and lower abdomen a little bit so that there's a lot of room in there. And it really makes sense to have a lot of room in there for your breath, right? It also does this remarkable thing where it really relieves a lot of the stress in your upper and middle back. When you do that, it can feel like the skin even at the back of your neck and in between your shoulder blades and so on is just sort of like crawling down your back, right? So what it does is it automatically relaxes a number of the muscles that are normally involved in, balancing your head and doing a bunch of other stuff like that. And then with respect to your head, it makes sense again to have your head float up and back so that your neck flattens out a little bit. Obviously, you can't really make your neck flat, but so that it flattens out a little bit and back. And it's as though this spot kind of right at the front of the crown of your head is being suspended somehow from the ceiling, right? It allows your face to fall into a vertical plane with your nose pretty much directly above your navel and your ears lined up with your shoulders. Then in terms of your arms, the energy in your shoulders is sort of out and down, and your shoulders are just resting there. So, and then the canonical hand posture, you bring your arms around in a big circle with your joints all open and sort of full of space, right? Place your left palm on top of your right palm. Bend your fingers around in a big round circle with your thumb tips lightly touching and your palms lightly resting, and your fingers lightly resting against each other. And then move that up right against your lower abdomen so that your thumb tips are, probably a little bit above your navel, just a bit, and everything else is sort of resting softly against your lower abdomen. Obviously other hand postures are good too, but this one works pretty well. If you move it up and down a little bit, sometimes you find a spot where it feels like the space in between your palms starts to warm up, the space in between your hands starts to warm up. That's sort of the right spot for it. If you don't find that, it's okay. Just keep your arms lightly engaged. You shouldn't have to be really lifting your hands. It should be relaxed and kind of comfortable, right? And sit with your eyes open, your teeth and lips both shut, and your tongue resting gently against the front roof of your mouth, except when you're talking. Well, everybody is really excited about underbelly. And then In terms of the breath, the sort of center of attention in Zazen is that spot at the bottom of your breathing apparatus, your hara, the middle of your body, a couple of inches below your navel, right? And so try this. Try bringing a little tension to your heart, just a teeny bit. So that means slightly tightening the muscles in your pelvic floor, slightly tightening your lower stomach muscles. And with that, breathe all the way out. Just let the breath collapse out of the body. At the bottom of the breath, pause. And then pretty soon your diaphragm is going to say, hey, time to breathe in. Just allow it. Just let any residual tension you have there go and let the breath rush in and fill your body. And then do it again. Do it a few times, 3 times, 5 times. Notice how when you do this really soft but deliberate out breath, it can sometimes pull some of the tension from your upper body and collapse it into your hara. Notice how the in-breath can feel like it sort of floats up your back and helps straighten your posture. And when you've done that for a bit, just let your breath relax into its natural length and depth. Whatever it usually does is fine, but keep your attention kind of in your hara and on your breath as you sit. And then we'll sit for a bit and then we'll talk about something. It'll be good. When we said the focus is generally on the full-on embodied experience of sitting. The sense of constantly engaging with the posture and the breath, arising of sensations all across our sensorium, the bird song, the specific engagement with the heart, with the body, the way in which the mind and body interact, and in some ways comment on each other. But of course, what happens is inevitably a thought arises that has enough juice, enough emotional weight or something like that, enough intrigue that it pulls in the awareness from the body and the larger picture of being a sitting human, and focuses it on thinking, which again, that's really kind of inevitable, and it's fundamentally not a problem. But it's worth noting that even right in the middle of that process, your body and sensorium regularly, not exactly constantly, but regularly make a subtle suggestion that now might be good time to pay attention, and not be tangled up in thinking and self-narration and self-construction, right? And often when those invitations to do that come in, we ignore them, particularly if the thought we're thinking has a sufficient amount of intrigue. But eventually they become sufficiently insistent that we naturally return to awareness. Sometimes it happens because of a particular sensation. Oh, there's a important pain in my knee. I should pay attention to that, and then attention is there, right? Sometimes it's a sensation from outside, the bird, the hum of the air conditioning unit, and the throb of the music in the other room. It doesn't matter what it is. Sometimes it just happens naturally in a way that's kind of rhythmic and regular, where your body and mind say, okay, that's enough of that thinking stuff. Why don't we pay attention? And when you take that invitation, notice what happens. Notice the broadening of perspective. Notice the sense of opening that arises. And then watch what happens next. Sorry. So any questions about the sitting, the posture, the experience, any of the stuff that I said, anything like that? Any questions, comments?
When you do this sort of sitting, how much do you recommend like really trying to focus the attention versus just like sort of doing nothing and letting it be?
Yeah, it's a really great question. On the side of just letting it be, right? In principle, the request in Zazen is to pay intimate, wholehearted attention to exactly what's arising now, and etc. Right? The complication there is that as I said while we were sitting, inevitably thoughts arise, and it's interesting, but if you really sit for, well, we just sat for roughly half an hour. If you sit for half an hour and you really pay attention to what's going on, there's this natural kind of interaction between the world and the body and mind that just goes on uninterrupted in some ways, right? It's like a sensation arises that has enough juice to be elevated into our perception. That perception, the singing of the bird or something like that, the twinge in my knee, causes a little bit of mental activity that's usually some combination of explanatory and maybe some kind of suggestion about what to do about it, or maybe not, right? But in any case, that process can happen in this really kind of smooth, organic, and undisturbed way, mostly in the light of awareness, right? However, when thoughts arise that have a particular level of intrigue or emotional weight or something like that, they pull our attention in from both from the body and also from everything else, and then essentially you're just sitting there ruminating and self-constructing, right? Which is not the idea, right? And so at that point, but as I said, you inevitably return to awareness, right? The transition into rumination is very hard to catch. In fact, my theory is that it's impossible to catch. But in any case, it's very hard to catch because there's this erasure that happens where your experience in the moment before you decided to think about, something compelling, right, is erased by the process of switching modes, right, from your erased from your awareness. But the the transition back into awareness from being involved in kind of ruminative thinking, that it doesn't take very long for that to happen once you start thinking, interestingly enough, is really different from the transition into it. Everything is visible: the thought, the emotions that are involved with it, the contents of your sensorium, the the awareness of your posture. All that stuff is there, right? And at that point, if you find you're getting lost in thought a lot, it can be helpful to really make a subtle effort to settle and be present with exactly what's going on, right? It's only a subtle effort. No, like self-punishment for thinking or something like that. Really, just kind of just to broaden your awareness and allow it to permeate everything, right? And watch what happens after that, right? Inevitably, you're going to have another thought that's sufficiently compelling that it wraps you up. But what you discover over the course, even of one period of zazen, but certainly over the period of a kind of lifetime of practice, is that those cycles get less extreme, and you start to realize that actually that mind that's broadly and receptively present with itself and with the body is always there. It's just that it gets obscured by our preoccupations, right? So does that help? Or
That was helpful.
Yeah.
I was also wondering though, like specifically, like you say, to focus attention on the breath and the lower part of the belly.
Mhm.
But at the same, is it sort of like you've probably read The Mind Illuminated by Kuladasa. Is it like you're sort of you're keeping attention at the belly, but then at the same time you have some sort of you're still aware of what's happening?
Yes, absolutely. That's right. Yeah, that's completely correct. And the level of attention that's applied to the hara, right, is it kind of can tail out to zero, right? And so when that happens, that's kind of really sitting, right? Something like that. Right? And then it can help to reinstate it if you discover that you're tangled up in thinking, right? And stuff like that. To reinstate that attention. But focus on the hara is a it's a technique, right? In the end, there are lots of techniques that are useful, but so for example, in the Rinzai school, they focus on phrases, right? They kind of pick a phrase out of the literature and boil it down to its kind of essence and carry it with them when they're sitting, keeping it in their mind, right? In this sort of subvocal, register, basically. All of these are techniques, and their function is to support a kind of broad, the arising of a kind of broad, receptive, unloaded attention that that can hold our other mental faculties in its, I don't know, as a container, basically. Does that help?
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, yeah. Anything else? Cool.
Nice.
Hmm?
That was nice.
Good.
Receptive.
That's great. Well, excellent. Let's see, what time is it? So here's what I thought I'd talk about a little bit today, and maybe then if you have any questions about that, we can talk about it. If not, we can sit some more, which would be good, right? But in any case, in the turning of the Dharma wheel sutta in the Pali Canon, it famously describes the Buddha's first sermon. And if you read the commentarial literature, particularly the modern commentarial literature, everybody makes it pretty clear that nobody really knows what the Buddha first said after he woke up. Right? It's the Pali Canon was written down. Well, the earliest extant version we have of it is it's like from the 7th century AD or something like that, right? So it's a long time after the life of Buddha, but nonetheless, right? Whoever wrote this sutta, the translation of which is essentially the turning of the Dharma wheel, of the Dhammacakka, right? He sets in motion the wheel of Dharma. That's the way we say it in the Mahayana literature, right? He explains the human predicament in these really kind of straightforward, uncomplicated terms, right? Like, life is suffering, and he mentions a whole bunch of things in the really straightforward translations of this. He mentions, a number of things that cause suffering, like dying, right? and so on and so forth, right? Or being sick, and getting old, and all the rest of that sort of thing. And then and then he says, and suffering arises from, and this gets variously translated. People are constantly trying to fancy it up, right? So people will say self-clinging, or grasping an aversion, or and a bunch of other things like that. It seems pretty clear that in the original it was it was essentially clinging, right? Not self-clinging, not some other fancy form of clinging, just clinging. And then he specifies specifically, he says, clinging to life and clinging to pleasure. That's kind of what he says in the second part of that. And it's not bad, but it seems to me that we can sort of unpack that mechanism a little bit more and have it be more useful, right? Like, clinging or grasping, I guess. So it's often translated. I mean, do either of you want to hazard a statement about what the capacities are, what the talents um, or capacities are that are most obviously or most valuably human? What do you think?
Choose how we react to things. If anything, that's
Well, yeah, I mean, certainly we react to things in a very, in a unique and uniquely human way, right? That's totally true.
the choosing.
Hmm?
The choosing of how we react.
Yeah. You mean as opposed to instinctually or automatically or something like that, right?
As opposed to just being reactionary.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's fair. Yeah, that's good. Anything else?
Bipedalism.
Hmm?
Bipedalism.
That is true. I mean, yeah. I mean, you could. Yeah. Yeah, that's true. Well, those are a good place to start, right? So, I'd say that it would be interesting actually to consider the effect that bipedalism has on this whole thing. It clearly has to have an effect, right? But but it's not entirely clear to me how. But yeah, good point, right? Um, I'd say this. So we have three, or at least three, matchless gifts that we've been given by some combination of genetic and cultural evolution, right? And one of them is our highly developed, um, grammatically rich, syntactically very complicated language, right? And, animals talk to each other; they absolutely do. Um, but to the best of our knowledge, and we're still trying to figure this stuff out about whales, for example. There's a whole bunch of stuff now. They're trying to do analysis on the click speech of sperm whales, just to see if we can figure out the grammar, right? Kind of interesting, um, but we know it's pretty clear that we have a very sophisticated language, right? And both semantically and grammatically sophisticated. So that's one. And the next one is we have this like hypertrophied sociality, right? Like like there are social insects that are super social, right? And they manage to cooperate on an astonishingly massive scale. But they're not also kind of independent, self-willed entities quite the way people are, right? And it's the same is true for like naked mole rats or something like that. Naked mole rats have a very sophisticated and effective sociality and live in large groups and so on and so forth. But they're still not. They're not independent actors in exactly the same way humans are. So we have this, the way we deal with that is that our sociality is, has many, many layers. So obviously we have a social framework that's the family, and and it's the primal one or something like that. But also there's larger and larger groups, and for us, we can have powerful social feelings about large groups of people that we've never met in our lives, like political parties or et cetera, right? It's kind of amazing, actually, the how thick it is, right? Which you can see how it's been tremendously helpful in kind of getting humans around in the world, right? We've thrived largely because of the rich, multi-layered nature of our sociality, right? So starting with those, right? How is suffering built into that, right? I mean, so we're talking about why humans suffer, right? Well, both our linguistic capacity and our sociality, and also the other one, which is our kind of pretty decent capacity for long range planning, right? All of those things rely on about separating the speaker and the spoken to, separating the subject and the object, right? With respect to planning, right? Separating out the planner and the plan, separating out the actor and the acted upon, and so on and so forth, right? So when we do that, right? When we rely on capacities that that have an actor and an acted upon, and so on and so forth, it requires that we have a complex, pretty sophisticated sense of the self, and so we do. We have we build a model for ourselves, right? And we hold it in our minds. It's not exactly the same as us, but it's our picture of the self, right? It's our self model, right? And we animate that in the world, and the world is also, for us, is also a model, right? And we animate it in such a way, in such a way, among other things, that we are successful in the ways that life wishes us to be successful. So, basically, we get food, we get shelter and safety, and get sex, so we can maybe have kids or something like that, right? I don't know, but in any case, so that our needs are taken care of, both in the context, both as individuals and in the context of our social framework, that's so much an important part of that, right? And all of these mechanisms that are our rich sociality, our language, and our capacity for planning, the way they operate is they're largely driven by their emotional underpinnings, right? So when you make a plan, you make the plan that feels good, right? And when you make a plan to stay away from something, you make that plan because it feels bad, right? And similarly, our navigation through our incredibly complicated social structure is based entirely on this kind of tropism, emotional tropism for the interactions that will give us, resources, support, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, all of that stuff, right? You can see why this leads to suffering, right? You have a whole bunch of individuals, you can imagine them all standing together on the planet, each of them with a with a different place, different conditioning, because each of us are conditioned by our genetics, our position in society, and et cetera, all of that stuff, right? We're all standing next to each other, looking at the world from a somewhere between a subtly and grossly different perspective, and we're driven by these, our human gifts require that we be driven by the emotional tags on our thoughts and behaviors, right? And in our experience with others as well, right? And so, obviously, if you have two people standing next to each other in this, notional picture of the world, and they agree on everything, then that's fine. But the chances that they agree on everything because of their place, perspective, et cetera, and trajectory through the world is inherently different. The idea that they're going to agree on everything just isn't going to happen, right? So then you get conflict, right? And the conflict can develop from a simple disagreement up to murderous behavior without really breaking a sweat, basically, and depending on the situation, right? So there's that, and then the other thing that comes into play is that if you study how your own mind works, and you study and talk with people about how their mind works, the interesting thing is that it seems like there's a component to the suffering that we do in addition to our self-reification, the social gymnastics involved in in getting enough resources and finding a sweet spot in whatever social matrix we're in, and our our constant planning and scheming and acting on those plans and so on and so forth. There's a component of the way we suffer that just seems like it's baked in, right? If you when and there's psychologists study this a lot, right? We're more likely to remember unpleasant experiences and carry the story and kind of emotional weight of those unpleasant experiences with us way longer and more convincingly than the other way around, right? When they're pleasurable experiences. And my sense is that component of human suffering just arises out of a kind of evolutionary injunction to stay a little off balance, right? Not to, settle down into a warm bath and not ever do anything ever again, right? So basically, to unpack all that, the main point is that our suffering, the way we cause ourselves to suffer, the way we the way we cause each other to suffer, and so on, is entangled with the gifts that make us human, basically, and it's inextricable from the gifts that make us human, which might be dispiriting, but it turns out that that what the Buddha said after that was, he said, well, there's a way out of it. And then he said, and then he lays out this program, and the program is good, right? But if you dig into, so it's a sort of, 8-pointed, PowerPoint slide, right? If you back up one slide, it's basically, it's wise up to what's going on, right? Change your life, modify the way you live such that it promotes more wising up, and meditate, basically, which is to say, if you, some, what is it, like 1400 years later, Dogen, the founder of Japanese Soto Zen, said, the way is to study the self. That's basically what he says. And to study the self is to forget the self. And to forget the self is to be awakened by every single thing. Every, by the circumstances of the world and the self moment by moment, right? So again, right? Wise up to what's going on, change your life so that it promotes more wising up, and study what it means to be a human being in this way, right? And that, according to Dogen, and kind of according to the Buddha, if you read the sutta about the benefits of the contemplative life, it basically says the same things. It says you obey the precepts, and you eventually develop a sort of sense of satisfaction and appreciation for being blameless, right? And then you study the self in formal practice in Zazen, basically. When the Buddha didn't say Zazen, but and in the same way, it's a gateway to what Dogen says is it's the Dharma gate of ease and joy, or repose and bliss, right? There's a kind of unconditioned appreciation for just the fact of being alive and the act of being alive that arises out of the practice, right? Including out of the practice of Zazen, right? And that that the sort of broad receptive attention that I was talking about earlier, that can hold our experience, and the connection that it makes with the world is a strong counterweight to the mechanisms of human suffering, right? It can hold the mechanisms of human suffering in a way that it acknowledges them, but doesn't automatically spin them out, basically. And that's what it's for. So, what time is it? Any questions about that? It was sort of a long ramble. I'm sorry.
Have you ever read Nietzsche?
I have read a fair amount of Nietzsche, and I like it. He has the most recent thing I read was the one where he makes this, what on the face of it sounds like outrageous claim. He says the foundation of all great art is gratitude, right? You ever read that? I forget what it's called, but it's yeah. Anyway, so yeah, every now and again I read from something from Nietzsche and I like it. So anyway, why do you ask?
Well, Nietzsche sort of the way he thinks that Buddhism, he thought that Buddhism, along with like most organized religions, were sort of this like hatred of life or something, and that and you can sort of see that with Buddhism. It's like the desire to like turn away from suffering at all costs, even if the result is like death or something. And it does seem to me like for a lot of monks and stuff, like that is the case. Specifically, like if they had amazing lives or something, would they sort of choose this life? You know.
Well, it's a great question. I mean, my experience. Well, okay, so I mostly studied Zen, right? And the reason I mostly studied Zen, interestingly, is that my mom was a Zen student in the 60s and 70s, right? And I ignored it up until the early 90s, and then sort of started digging into it. And my take on the Zen school is that it has an interesting quality. First of all, it was the rationale for practice in Zen Buddhism is to bring people into the world who are comfortable and skillful with the human condition and can be helpful and productive members of society, basically. That and I, and that was one of the transformations that happened to Buddhism when it went from uh, South and Central Asia to China, was that the you know the the Chinese were kind of uncomfortable with the notion that you had to reject the world, right? And they really didn't like that, and it was kind of a barrier to the acceptance of Buddhism. And the documents that you can find that were intended to kind of ease that transition are all things about lay people that have have you ever run across the Vimalakirti Sutra? It's this guy, Vimalakirti. It's supposedly who lived in the time of Buddha, and um, it's about this guy who he's a lay person, and he has family, and he has business, and he goes to you know he even goes to like bars and gambling dens. It says just to spread the Dharma, right? And so on. And it says that he's kind of sick, right? He's unwell. And so the Buddha calls all his disciples together and says, Vimalakirti is sick. Why doesn't somebody go see him and inquire after his health? And one after another, they're like, oh, Lord, I couldn't possibly do that. I had this embarrassing encounter with him the other day where he demonstrated that I was kind of an idiot, and I would feel uncomfortable going to see Vimalakirti. And finally, the Buddha says, okay, fine, we'll all go. And so the Buddha and all his disciples and all these spirit beings and demons and all these other characters get together, and they all crowd into Vimalakirti's house, which is the size of this stage, right? And they have this debate, right? And the I think it's Manjushri, the Bodhisattva of great wisdom, and Vimalakirti have this debate, and Vimalakirti wins it hands down. So I guess the whole point of this is that in Chinese Buddhism, it wasn't so much about withdrawing from the world, and underlying that is a sort of more complicated claim about the nature of suffering and whether it's even humanly possible to not suffer. And I think the answer is it's not humanly possible to not suffer, right? The 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 relief comes not from never having suffering arise in your body and mind. It comes from having a skillful and comfortable methodology whereby you can meet that and everything else in the world. Basically, a continuous practice whereby you can meet that and everything else in the world. But it is true that there is a thread in Buddhism that has to do with really rejecting the world, right? Nobody really knows what the original Buddhism was, but the practitioners that claim to be following the words of the Buddha directly, and only the words of the Buddha directly, generally go for a lot of renunciation, right? Like really like renouncing just about everything about the world in a way that you can see how it might be useful, but it has its problematic aspects. For example, you know, well, in many of the countries where stuff is practiced, it's impossible for women to become monks, right? That wasn't always the case, I think, but it was. But in any case, you have to really not even come close to, or so all the practitioners are male, and they have to really not close to come, speak directly to or touch in any way women, right? It's difficult, and not necessarily. It seems to me not necessarily helpful. But anyway, but I mean, my take on it is that at least in the case of the Zen school, it's more about learning how to live comfortably and skillfully in the world in a way that's helpful, basically. And to live with your own suffering and the suffering of others in a way that helps alleviate it and makes the world feel like there's more possibilities rather than less, basically, something like that. So when you meditate, what's it like for you, and what do you experience benefits, and what's the nature of those benefits?
I think that it increases my concentration and
Yeah.
my ability to turn, just like stop lines of thought. Yeah, it gives me more self-control.
Yeah, I think that's good. And yeah, I guess I would say skill in living in this body and mind, right? Yeah, right. Yeah, that's good. How do you use it? Do you meditate every day, or how does that work exactly?
Yeah, I meditate for an hour a day. I did a Goenka retreat.
Yeah.
In August of last year. So I did a lot of body scanning. Now I'm getting more into like hula dasa style, like concentrating, because for a while I was sort of I sort of went from Russian Orthodoxy straight into Buddhism, and so I was still into like the sort of mythical aspect and stuff.
Mhm.
Now I'd say I'm just like a total materialist. So it's like I want to like have the benefits of meditation, like lots of self-control and the ability to concentrate really precisely on the task at hand.
Yeah. That's good. My experience is that also when you do that, other things sneak up on you. Like it's possible to have very surprising experiences, which are marvelous but surprising, right? If you tune your mind in that way, right? Like being totally bowled over by a flower, or the one that's happened to me most recently, I was hiking on Mount Tam and walked into a forest that was full of these little tiny migratory birds, and they were all making these noises like and all of a sudden, and because the noises were very precisely locatable because of their frequency and their shape and so on. All of a sudden, in my head or in my body, the whole shape of the forest became apparent. It was like the forest was inside my body, or I was turned inside out, or something like that. It was really an amazing experience. It was marvelous, actually. Right? Those things become more accessible because you're not simply entangled in rumination and self-construction all the time, basically, which is nice. Yeah. Well, it was really great sitting with you and great talking with you as well. It was good. And I think we ran over, but it's okay because, what else are we going to do? So thanks so much.
Thank you.
Yeah.